Okay, so here's our second video and we'll wrap this up pretty quickly. Okay, so as we mentioned, we're trying to make sense of Singapore, which has a draconian government with laws that are very severe in punishing things like crime, immorality, but also is geared towards stifling any kind of criticism or opposition to its rule. But at the same time has created a very robust free trade economic system that's aligned with the United States and the other East Asian tigers in the 1980s and 1990s, and seemingly has dramatically improved the lives of this city-state's residents, okay? So we can use this United Nations metric to kind of evaluate Singapore and the health of this society. And what we find is that in the three baskets, it obviously ranks in the very bottom third of the world's countries, like the rights of its citizenry to free speech, to run for office, to have their voices reflected in the government is very, very poor as many other large authoritarian states we see in other areas of the world. But in the last two baskets, the effectiveness of its government and the standard of living of its people, it ranks among the world's best. In 2012, it's the world's wealthiest and healthiest country. I'm sorry, the world's healthiest country. It has the lowest crime rates, and less than 1% of 5.5 million people struggle to find food or shelter. Compare that, if you will, with cities like Chicago, New York, Beijing, Tokyo, where we have much, much more crime, where we have pollution, and we also have a lot of people that are homeless or living on the margins of society. Now, seemingly that kind of validates the political philosophy of Lee Kuan Yew, who has this quote here that says, "The ultimate test of the value of a political system is whether it helps that society establish conditions that improve the standard of living for the majority of its people." So by his system, he says basically, as long as I deliver in those last two baskets, as long as the government can address problems, think of the coronavirus, for example. As long as it can meet some kind of external challenge, like how to stop the spread of a virus and protect its citizens, and as long as people have access to education and see their lives become more convenient, more fluent, and better off in terms of things like their freedom from crime, you see, he says, then the system is working and the country is healthy. And this helps reinforce the notion that a dictatorship or elite should govern a society, at least in the eyes of Lee Kuan Yew. We see this reflected in kind of the perspective of a journalist from Singapore, Calvin Chung, also quoted here. Calvin Chung says, "Freedom is being able to walk on the streets unmolested in the wee hours in the morning. To be able to leave one's door open and not fear that one would be burgled. Freedom is the woman who can ride buses and trains alone, and freedom is not having to avoid certain subway stations after night falls." So freedom is freedom from fear, freedom from crime, freedom from violence in a society. And to him, that's more important than, say, having an opportunity to run for public office or having multiple political parties and leaders to choose from. Or at least it's important and offsets those losses. These quotes also help explain why Lee Kuan Yew probably, when asked by the Wall Street Journal in 1999 what the most important invention of the 20th century was, the elderly dictator chose the air conditioner, not the television or nuclear weapons or spacecraft. He chose the air conditioner because living in a semi-tropical environment, this invention provided comfort and convenience in the home for many people in Singapore. And it also made workplaces such as factory floors or public schools much more productive and bearable for the people that had to spend their daily lives there. But it also probably represents a metaphor for his belief that governments could make people docile and they would accept elite rule or the loss of certain freedoms and rights so long as their personal lives were comfortable and their pocketbooks were rewarded. Okay, so some takeaways you should reflect upon after this lecture. The emergence of the Asian tigers and their economic miracles puts enormous pressure on communist nations in the 1970s and 1980s to reform, to think about restructuring their economies or towards embracing a more liberal, freer economic system. Once home to the poorest economies and populations in the world, South Korea, Taiwan, and Singapore follow Japan on a path to modernization that seemingly proves the superiority of capitalism, free trade, and also the benefits of aligning themselves with the United States. Moreover, it's during this time in the 1990s, and especially today, that Lee Kuan Yew and Singapore also show that economic liberalization need not threaten the control over a country by one party or one figure, like a dictator like Lee Kuan Yew. And this makes it in some ways more popular in the People's Republic of China. Lee's model in Singapore are especially influential on the reforms of Deng Xiaoping taken in the 1980s and 1990s that put China on a path to its own economic miracle that's going to lift over 300 million people out of abject poverty in that country. The popularity of his model in China, India, and many African states is going to help open up new markets in areas of the global economy. But few of these countries achieve the same level of success in effective governance, having governments that can address problems very, very expediently and deliver outcomes that the public wants. And we haven't seen in those places the free market economy and the combination of a dictatorship or a one-party state deliver a raising standard of living that seems comparable to what we saw in Singapore from the 1960s to the 2000s. And this raises important questions about whether or not an example set by a small city-state in Southeast Asia, so just one city-state, is really a good template for much larger nations with bigger challenges, bigger populaces, territories to all unite and rein in. Or if Singapore is actually home to a benevolent dictatorship, which a lot of historians and political scientists would still question whether or not this system really does benefit the people. Is that a recipe that can be replicated elsewhere? Or is a benevolent dictatorship in Singapore an outlier, an anomaly? It's kind of this one case that proves the exception to the rule about the need for political freedoms and economic open systems to go hand in hand. Don't forget, if you have questions after viewing the lecture, to email me at mille932@miamioh.edu, or you can send me text messages, phone calls, 513-892-9933. We'll have more lessons next week, although please check your announcements. There are going to be some ways that I'm going to restructure your assignments to lessen your burden. I'm sure a lot of you are overwhelmed with all the change and transition here. So what we want to do to make sure that you have academic success is kind of lighten the burden of those assignments and make sure that you're still just doing some reading and following along. Okay? So send me your questions and have a good week.